the all-women's group that in 1858 came together to rescue Mount Vernon, for the last 160 years has independently pursued its mission of preservation and education, educating the world about the life and legacy of our first president. Welcome to Mount Vernon. My name is Doug Bradburn. I'm the president and CEO. I'm only the 11th person to have this role since 1858. They used to be called the resident director. Now they're called the president and CEO, but that's just like grade inflation. It's the same role. So call me the resident director if you like, but it's a great honor for me to be here, and I'm really delighted you all came out in the midst of these times, in this weather, for what's going to be an incredible program, our Founding Debates program, which was created to mark the anniversary of the opening of our presidential library. The Fred W. Smith National Library for the Study of George Washington opened in 2013. So what does that make this? This is I'm a history major, not a math major. This is the 8th year of honoring that opening. And I'm delighted to say a special thank you to the Ammerman Family Foundation, Dr. Dennis Franks and Joy Ammerman Franks, and Michael and Stephanie Franks, who have generously supported this program year in and year out in honor of Jim Reese, who was a longtime president of Mount Vernon, whose vision lives on in that extraordinary library over there. So thanks very much to the Ammerman Family Foundation for supporting this program. Now, before we begin the night's exciting program, we have a very special presentation to make that actually fits very well with the theme of the evening. We have the Mount Vernon History Teacher of the Year Award, which is funded by the Robertson Foundation and is presented annually to one teacher in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area who brings creativity and passion to their teaching and represents the very best values of their work. They generate a love of learning, they deepen the students' understanding and appreciation of history. The winner receives a cash award of $5,000, as well as a fully funded field trip to Mount Vernon for their students. The runner-up receives $500 and distance learning programs for their students. This year marks the 13th anniversary of this award, and are pleased to honor two very deserving local teachers this evening. Now, this evening's runner-up is Cassandra Sainville. She is the department chair and associate professor of social sciences at Bard High School, Early College in Washington, D.C. In addition to teaching, Ms. Sainville is the founder and chief executive officer of Ametka College Prep in D.C., whose, quote, mission is to prepare an anti-racist teacher workforce. A colleague of Dr. Cass, she is known to her students, was able to leverage, quote, virtual learning not just to get students through a rough, tough content during an unprecedented year, but actually use it to raise up student voices as they examine the history of their city, their nation, and many marginalized American voices and perspectives. Please join me in recognizing this year's runner-up for the Mount Vernon History Teacher of the Year, Cassandra Sainville. Cassandra. Thank you very much. Appreciate your hard work. Thank you. You had a tough year. Now, this year's Mount Vernon History Teacher of the Year is Sean Miller, who is beginning his 8th year in the classroom teaching social studies at South County High School here near Lorton, Virginia. In a letter of recommendation for the award, a colleague wrote that, quote, Sean is exceptional at what he does. Moreover, he inspires people around him, both students and colleagues, to want to do better. Sean embodies the concept of teacher, leader, innovator that I wish all of our social studies educators internalize. Now, in addition to teaching, as if that's not enough, he serves as his school's department chair and has been a key member of division-level teams leading ambitious professional learning and curriculum development to support all our K-12 social studies teachers and administrators. A recommender also noted, quote, Mr. Miller's expertise as a culturally responsive social studies educator, scholar of history, and unwavering advocate for students' needs has fostered important and overdue change in our system within and well beyond his classroom. Please join me in recognizing the 2021 Mount Vernon History of the Year, Sean Miller.
Look at this. Congratulations. Thank you, wonderful to see you here. Thanks for your hard work. Thank you. Wonderful.
It's a great evening to recognize teachers, and a theme of the night is going to talk about education and its role in our republic, in the very fabric of who we are as a collective polity that tries to govern itself. Why don't I get to just tell everybody here what they're supposed to do? I mean, some of my employees are saying, well, you do that. But we have to work together as a community, as a community, as a state, as a nation, to work together to solve our challenging problems. And that's the representative self-government ideal that we have. But how can it function without education, without an educated citizenry? And we're going to start at the very beginning with the base at the foundation of this nation and think seriously about some of the challenges and opportunities that were put forward by some of the people that we know more famously as the founding fathers of our country. And so we're going to kick off this special evening with our first guest speaker, Andrew O'Shaughnessy, Vice President of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, the Saunders Director of the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello, and a professor of history at the University of Virginia, and a good friend of mine. He's the author of numerous books, including The Men Who Lost America, which received the 2014 George Washington Prize, and his newest title, The Illimitable Freedom of the Human Mind, Thomas Jefferson's Idea of a University, which will be available for sale and for signing after tonight's reception. And I really do hope you take advantage of this opportunity to get Andrew to sign your book for you, which makes a great present for yourself and for your loved ones, and is an extraordinary book. Now, Andrew is a great friend of Mount Vernon, who will join me to discuss the founders and civic education. Andrew O'Shaughnessy, take the stage, please. Now, Andrew's going to be the star of the show, but everybody who knows me knows I've got to get my pound of flesh. It will be brief. But one of the things that's remarkable about Andrew's book, which studies Thomas Jefferson's vision for the creation of the University of Virginia. Jefferson, one of the very, very few heads of state anywhere in world history who imagined, envisioned, and executed the creation of a university, which at the time he thought would be the most modern and most extraordinary university in the world, really, on that scale. It was a passion of many of the founders, which I'm going to ask Andrew to talk about. I have just an incredible collection of quotes from our guy, George Washington, about education, which in many ways reflects the vibe of the era, the ethos of the desire to have an educated citizenry, and fits very much well within our conversation tonight. And one of the quotes I thought I'd share with you as we kick it off, Washington died in 1799 in December, and one of the last letter he wrote to anyone outside of this little community, he wrote to someone who managed his estate here. But before that, one of the last letters he wrote was a letter about education. And it was in support of Alexander Hamilton's effort to create a military academy, which is something Washington had sponsored, a national military academy going back to his presidential years in 1793. But he also noted this: in a free and republican government, you cannot restrain the voice of the multitude. Everyone will speak as they think, or more properly, without thinking. Now, this is a correspondence he had in the midst of the war, in the war years. And I like to juxtapose it with another quote, which is in his farewell address, so the end of his public service. Promote then as an object of primary importance institutions for the general diffusion of knowledge. In proportion as the structure of a government gives force to public opinion, it is essential that public opinion should be enlightened. So it's the role of the state in a Republican government to help support institutions that will help with a general diffusion of knowledge so that the citizenry who govern themselves will govern themselves well. And that's a critical aspect, I think, of the ethos of the founder's vision for education and citizenship. So let's begin our conversation, Andrew, with those Washingtonian moments before we go straight Jefferson all the time. Lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you.
Turn my mic on. All right. So you wrote this extraordinary book on Jefferson's founding of the University of Virginia. Not everybody here knows. I'm an inside character. I'm an alum of the University of Virginia, so he's got an easy audience here. But tell them all, what did Jefferson want to be remembered for on his tombstone? Did he want to be remembered as the president of the United States, the governor of Virginia, all these incredible roles he had? What did he want on his tombstone?
So Jefferson wanted to be remembered for 3 achievements on his tombstone: author of the Declaration of American Independence,
Never heard of it?
the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. I took 2 English visitors who knew very little American history to see this. One said, well, of course, those are the 3 great freedoms: political freedom, religious freedom, intellectual freedom. And Jefferson thought that intellectual freedom was dependent on religious and political freedom. And this will be crucial in how he conceived a university. The other was a marketing person who was head of one of the world's largest marketing companies. And he said, well, this is a very smart politician. And this actually comes through a lot in the book, the almost mischievous political skills of Jefferson, because you're appealing really to abstract ideas and ideals. If you mention presidency of the United States or Secretary of State, people just remember your errors or what they were against. It was a smart strategy. But as Doug said in the opening statement, I personally cannot think of any head of state in any period of time who spent so long conceiving of a university, envisioning it, and then implementing it. And he was engaged in every aspect. As a lawyer, he drafted the bills for the university. As an architect, he designed the university, which is regarded as one of the great campuses of all time. And incidentally, it was the most expensive series of public project at the time, other than really the Erie Canal and the building of Washington, D.C. It cost more to build than the entire endowment of Yale and the entire income of Yale since it had been built in the 1730s and was a major, it wasn't just one big building, it was a series of buildings which we'll come to later. He knew the name of every student at the university. He personally wined and dined them all on a Sunday evening and entertained them. Some of them were as young as 16. They couldn't spell the word republic, as one professor recalled. A few of them spelt it republic or public. And yet all of them said how he treated them as an equal, how he engaged with them as an intellectual. He designed the curriculum and set out the criteria for creating the university. As a bibliophile, he listed every book to go in the library, over 6,000 titles. It instantly became the second largest library in America after Harvard University, which was the first university founded in America in the early 17th century. Only Yale had a collection of the equivalent size, and that had been around a century. So it really was the most fabulous conception. It's always been treated as just the epilogue of his career. I've deliberately left the name. I'm not an alumnus, and I deliberately left the name of the university out because I think it's much more important than.
We used to have bumper stickers that just said the university.
That's right.
And everybody knew what we were talking about.
And
that's not fashionable anymore. But it was called Central College, I think, when it was originally.
That's right.
Incorporated.
And I deliberately left it out because I think this topic is far more important. And I won't give a lecture for each answer, but it's far more important than just for UVA alumni. I think a lot of people need to be aware of this because it had a huge impact on American higher education, which is something that I believe has been missed. It was a wonderfully creative and innovatory idea.
Yeah, let me stop you there. Let me ask you about that.
Yes.
Because, Virginia had a university. They had
Yes.
William and Mary. Jefferson went there. It couldn't have been terrible, right? He's so great. He wrote all these things. He did all these things. What was wrong with William and Mary? What was the problem with it from Jefferson's point of view? Why wasn't it adequate?
It was a good question, and in many ways, it's the second oldest university. As you said, it was a remarkable institution. It created much of the elite in Virginia in the late 18th and early 19th century. Virginians took a lead role in the revolution. Of course, it's always seen as paradoxical that with a third of its population enslaved, that should be true. And of course, that tainted everything in Virginia, including the university. But still, we owe them many of the very positive legacy that we've inherited from them. And William and Mary had trained that elite. Jefferson's initial idea during the American Revolution was to just reform William and Mary and to make that, and as far as I see, that was his idea. He wanted a university that had national standing. He ultimately wanted it to be the best university in America and ultimately to outrival Europe. His ambitions were huge. So he began by trying to reform William and Mary, and he tried to get a bill passed in the legislature in 1779. The same year, he put forward what would have been the plan for the first public school system in the world in 1779. Massachusetts and Scotland educated a high proportion of their population, but no country, not even Prussia, had a systematic, fully working public school system at that time.
Why was he attracted to education?
Well, I think it's from his basic intellectual bent, but the American Revolution was the impetus. What disappointed me about William and Mary, it was basically a religious foundation. It was a private college, which I must admit I'd not quite realized when especially as the state was reforming and changing it, they felt entitled to do so, as they did with Harvard at the same time, but it remained private. And he secularized it to a degree in that he just abolished the theology and the subjects that supported theology and introduced sciences at the university, and he was able to do a certain amount of changes on the board, but eventually he just became convinced that it would always be a religious institution. It would always basically be Episcopalian, that there were limits to his change. And to some extent, as he got older, he became embarrassed by it. He was critical of the architecture. He thought the location was awful. He was hoping that they would move it. And once they started moving it, he could dissolve the university and literally take all its funds and use them for the University of Virginia. And we'll see a lot of instances in this story of how canny he was as a politician.
We university presidents have to find money by hook or by crook all
Yes.
over the place. Jefferson was part of that. But, so what were some of the? So you mentioned the religious angle. I mean, that's one of the things I think that's so innovative about the University of Virginia. He did not want it to be dominated by a religious aspect. I mean, a lot of the other colleges, as you mentioned, William and Mary, Hampton-Sydney was a Presbyterian school. What became Washington and Lee, Liberty Hall in Lexington, Washington Academy was a Presbyterian trainer, minister. So why was he so interested in not having a religious angle in the school?
And he would have argued he was not anti-religious. What he feared is that once you have a religious school, one denomination would gain control, and that they would then set the agenda. And I mean, it's fairly common. I know all of the other colleges at the time not only insisted that students go to chapel, they insisted they go to chapel twice a day. So it was a really very serious commitment. And by far the most influential denomination at the time were the Presbyterians. They did more than anyone in founding schools in late 18th and early 19th century. Now, it happened that the main location of the Presbyterians was New England, and that many had been Federalists, although by no means all, but they were Jefferson's opponents. And of course, Jefferson detested them. He thought they were trying to resurrect monarchy, make Britain, make America a satellite, a colonial satellite of Britain, that they'd resurrect aristocracy. So he was very worried that it seemed that the school and university systems, Yale, which was a great Presbyterian establishment, trained more university presidents than any other college. He was frightened it was coming under their control. And the election of 1800, I think, is key. No one has ever pointed out that Jefferson first put forward the idea in the words, the University of Virginia, in 1800, and that's a terribly important date because that is the date that he was elected president, and it was one of the most bruising presidential campaigns of any time period. The rhetoric could compare to now, but one thing that Jefferson hugely resented was that Northern clerics, and especially presidents of universities, were some of his biggest critics, and said he was an atheist, that he would make this like revolutionary France. We'd be guillotining people on the streets and having to sing the Car Ira, the sort of French revolutionary anthem. And in fact, the president of Yale wanted students, that Timothy Dwight, thank you, he wanted students to take an oath that they would not vote for Jefferson at any future period. And even in the South, the universities were largely dominated by Presbyterians and Federalists. Hampden-Sydney, Washington, what's now Washington and Lee, what was then Washington College or Academy.
Well, so you're bringing this up, a real strong sense that there's everyone is, Jefferson is particularly keenly aware of the ideological impact of education.
Yeah.
And this is something, you know, in Washington's will, he specifically, because he does give, he does provide money for an eventual national university. He provided money from the James River Canal Company to help fund Liberty Hall, which became Washington and Lee. And philanthropy. And one of the things he complained about, which he shared with Jefferson, is that Americans, he was worried they were going to Europe and they would learn these monarchical principles in Europe at this formative age. And so you had to have American institutions. And Jefferson had a particular idea of a particular kind of republicanism that you needed. because he doesn't like these federalists in New England. He doesn't like the religious stuff. So we think of sometimes today, I think universities as being apolitical, or we complain that they're not apolitical. We complain that they're too political. We complain that they're indoctrinated. I mean, Jefferson wanted to indoctrinate in some ways. I mean, so he didn't want monarchists. What was his vision for what he wanted?
He wanted UVA to become the pillar of the Republican system. Jefferson's primary concern was preserving the Union and preserving the Republican system of government. And when you read his language today, it sometimes sounds hysterical, but you have to remember that the majority of revolutions fail. Think of the Arab Spring and how promising that period was, and indeed spread the democracy to so many countries. But in most cases, it failed. Most revolutions end in civil war and virtual anarchy. And and Jefferson, of course, was not alone in this. They were all terrified. What is interesting in Jefferson's vision, and you say that to some extent it was circumscribed and wanted to prescribe some of what would be taught, is that in Prussia and in Europe, actually absolute monarchs took a lead in founding public education and were doing a better job than Britain and America at the time. But they wanted public schools to strengthen the state, to train future bureaucrats, to actually make the state much more centralized, much more effective. Whereas Jefferson wanted the people to be educated as a check on government and to be willing to recall their leaders and to carefully watch what was happening and participate in the process. And he wanted the very elite, what he called a natural aristocracy, the very elite of people who would go to university. Remember, less than 1% of the American population went to university in this time period. He wanted them to be good leaders and to be willing to set aside their self-interest rather than pursue ambition. And he feared more than anything else the sort of personality type of Alexander Hamilton. He saw as incredibly ambitious, dangerously bright, and with a love much too much of getting on horseback in uniform and leading armies. Another Napoleon in the making.
You and I would both love to be on horseback in uniform. When people started shooting,
we don't
go the other direction. Sure. But so look, so Jefferson didn't want monarchists. He didn't want federalists. But a lot of people would suggest that he founded the University of Virginia at a time when he was worried about abolitionists. That the university, in the face of growing criticism of the institution of slavery in the North, that what would happen if the youth of the South went to these northern universities? Would they come back as abolitionists and transform society? So to what extent was that a part of his worldview, do you think?
So during the American Revolution, the great fear was of Americans, and just before, Americans going to England and being influenced by English way of thinking and being turned into monarchs. Jefferson talked about the danger of the state losing a lot of students to the north, and has become voguish recently to explain this in terms of the fear that they would be influenced by abolitionism. The problem is that northern universities were not abolitionists. In fact, they were incredibly pro-slavery, both Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. Universities did not play a big role in stopping slavery. The irony is it was evangelical Christians who led the fight against slavery, and the very people that Richard Hofstadter in his book anti-intellectualism in America sees as the real enemy. But in terms of just making a moral case against slavery, I mean, professors were um, uh, forced out or terminated at Harvard. I give instances in the book. It would have also been strange because Jefferson certainly claimed to be very anti-slavery. The other problem with the argument, that's right. Yeah. The other problem with the argument is that slavery was not the big issue between North and South in the 1780s and 1790s. There were lots of other reasons why the South disliked the North. One was tariffs, another was banking and the currency system, and distrust of it, and the creation of an over-central state. But that was because it was bad for the Southern economy. Independent of slavery, Southern products went abroad, and the idea that they were being taxed to protect Northern manufacturers, and this remained an issue throughout the antebellum period. And they saw England as as a very good market, although that wasn't the issue. So both parties, although once out of power, some Federalists became anti-slavery. The fact is they were in power throughout the 1790s. They never took any action. Jefferson firstly created a Western ordinance that was not passed. It lost by a vote of one, but it would have abolished the expansion of slavery anywhere in the West. And part of it was adopted. It became the Northwest Ordinance, and slavery was not permitted after an initial period. Slavery was not to be continued anywhere in the Northwest, which meant it never existed in states like Wisconsin and was soon removed from Ohio. And of course, I mean, this is terribly important because if it had gone into the South, if this had passed, and the very raison d'etre of the Civil War was about the expansion of slavery, not the continuance of slavery, which Lincoln claimed at least he wasn't questioning. The other thing he did once in office was to bring an end to the slave trade at the earliest opportunity. And some people would say, well, that actually meant that any slave owner, the value of their personal human property rose, seen crudely. But if you read his preamble to what he said to Congress, why this must go in very moral terms, it seems fairly genuine. And he always insisted through the rest of his life that this was an urgent matter, but that the whole point of a new generation was that they would take on issues like this and solve them, especially a well-educated generation.
Right, so the vision is there for a university. Let's talk about the reality. The architecture has been recognized as a world historical site, world heritage site, and it's most famous. Well, what are the other legacies of his relationship with it? What did he innovate? Did it have any impact outside of this particular school?
I make the case it did. The most current history of higher education in America is by Roger Geiger. It's actually excellent and very comprehensive, except in its treatment of the University of Virginia. It says that this was just a finishing off school for Southern gentlemen, and that this was no model for any university. But he does say something interesting. He says it's sui generis, without really expanding on that. The point is, Yale was the most influential university at the time. This was the most influential alternative model. The most distinctive feature of it was its secularity and not having a chapel and not teaching theology. And this had a number of benefits. It had the first Jewish professor in America who happened to be British, called Josiah Sylvester. And he was a brilliant mathematician. He introduced the graph and the term graph, which even I, as a non-mathematician,
Wow, I've heard of that.
yeah, I've heard of that, and thank you for translating for me as well. He also he also introduced Hebraic um, letters as part of the mathematical alphabet. Is a major figure. A lot of his contribution I mention without understanding, but mathematicians are very familiar with it. It's the danger of trying to write about all fields. You're well out of your depth, or at least I am. Um, very unusual in having Catholics teaching on the staff. Jefferson wanted the best faculty in the country. He said, we can't make up for the antiquity of these other universities, while we can get up and start running by having, and he wanted them to be paid the highest salaries in America.
In book. I mean, part of the, obviously Jefferson wanted an architectural education for the students there in the buildings, but also he said if we just built a barn, we wouldn't be able to attract the best professors.
Yes.
There's this idea between the aesthetics of the place and the quality of the people that you could bring in. Talk a little bit about the early students there. What were
right?
We know that they were. I don't know. What wasn't it a violent place? I mean,
yes.
Students running around beating each other up and all this.
I did want to just make one more point in relation to your last question. I could give you a whole list of ways that it was innovative, but the thing that was really copied at the time was the idea of an elective curriculum. That students chose their own courses, and to some extent, although they were limited to do it between 3 subjects, to some extent they had a lot more freedom than today, in that they could take the courses in any order. There were no required courses, and this is now a hallmark of American education. It's something I didn't have in my education, but this is what distinguishes America as the elective system. And the elective system had come from Europe, from France, but and they initially tried it in North Carolina and William and Mary, but it was the University of Virginia that really became the yes, and that was most well known about. And we might return, if we've got time, to its influence, because I can give a lot of specific examples of its influence on other colleges. But
yeah, well, let's do that.
Yes.
Let's do that now. I don't
yes.
know if I'm being picked up, but I think some of the early students became faculty at other places. Other presidents of universities were attracted to this idea later in the 19th century.
Well, I mean, one of the best example is Harvard. UVA was the first to introduce examinations in a systematic way, to introduce lectures rather than recitation. That, believe it or not, was the practice, although other universities had got over to the lecture system. Examinations were much more novel, although Harvard and Yale began to introduce them about the same time. But the presidents of Harvard, from the time of Jefferson up to the 1960s, there are about 5 who really stand out as major figures who've had a big influence on higher education outside of Harvard, have all been fascinated by Jefferson. One in the 1960s even did a book on Jefferson's ideas of education. But the first one after Jefferson died was Josiah Quincy. And as soon as he was appointed at Harvard, he started to come down to Charlottesville to see the University of Virginia. He got as far as Washington, only to discover, and this is very topical, that there was a typhoid epidemic, and the students, they're basically in lockdown and isolation, so he had to turn around and go back. the first president of MIT, his wife said that MIT was conceived at the University of Virginia. He introduced a lot even of some of the odd eccentricities of the university, like, for example, not having honorary degrees. That's true also in MIT. He went straight from UVA to MIT. University of Texas, Austin was largely founded, and indeed, one of the great historians and academics in the late 19th century, Johns Hopkins, one of the first of that Hopkins faculty, Henry Baxter Adams, said that there's nowhere in the South that hasn't been influenced by the University of Virginia. I know today people point out it trained a lot of the leaders of the Confederacy, and that is important to be aware of. It's, I think, important to not just to judge history, but to judge ourselves and to realize that universities and schools are a product of their time. And they often reflect the weaknesses of those times. And sadly, they don't fully transcend it. But the fact is that the university trained much of the elite for everything in all ways of life, including law.
Your
business.
discussion in the
Yeah.
book, I think, of that early student body is quite
Yes.
innovative and interesting, because you read anecdotes about that early class and there's violence and drunkenness, and you're like, oh, well, these guys, not good guys. But you looked at it comparatively. You looked at students at universities in Europe and in the North, and like how 16 to 20-year-old men behaved at these places. And,
Yes.
and how did UVA compare?
Well, and it was really an aristocratic tradition. The tales, and everybody enjoys the tales of student riots at UVA, but they're always treated as something that was unique. Or that this was something of the South, especially. I compared directly the University of Virginia and Harvard. Harvard was much more riotous in the same period. They had bombs going on. An entire half class was dismissed. Quincy Adams's son was sent down from Harvard. Even his father couldn't get him returned to the college for misbehavior. And certainly, and we all know about the German drinking fraternities and the traditions in Germany. Europe was even more extreme because you also had political issues, so they were genuinely rather like the 60s here. But the great hero of students at this time was the British radical poet and writer Lord Byron, who was the kind of Che Guevara of the early part of the 19th century. But what I do is analyze what did students study, what courses were they taking, how much use did they make of the library, and I had very surprising results. The most popular subject at the University of Virginia was mathematics. Indeed, it seemed to me they chose some of the hardest subjects. Medicine, of course, was very popular. Hardly what you would think would go with a very party school. It's true, most of them only spent a year there, but that was pretty typical and was somewhat went with this sort of gentleman-like attitude. Remember, these people were elites as they were in Boston and elsewhere, and certainly true in Europe. So a period at university was in some ways a way to complete their schooling, but it produced some great students from that early period. The most famous, of course, is Edgar Allan Poe, but a number of influential students. A very little known one that I begin with the book with a man called Tirrett, who later became the first president of the University of Alabama and then founded his own school. And it was an unusual school. It was one of the first to admit women. And one of the things I like to show is that there's a progressive tradition that grows out of the University of Virginia. He was also very unusual in that he was anti-slavery and joined the anti-slavery organization, one of the very few in the South. And although some argue it became a center of pro-slavery thought, it was also the only university really in the South to have an anti-slavery tradition. So as late as 1858, the students were banned from having an abolitionist come and speak to them, who incidentally was an alumnus. Jefferson's own grandson brought forward an emancipation bill in the early 1830s. And this man, Tirrett, his daughter went on to be a president of a college, and he gave a marvelous description of the 50th reunion, marking the first 50 years of the university. He gave a marvelous description with which I open the first chapter of the book, of what it was like to be a student dining at Monticello. And I don't want to give the impression that this is just an analytical book written for fellow educators. The great thing is you're telling really the retirement story of a man aged 73 to 83 who's involved in this obsession. And Tirrett describes how the Jefferson was going slightly deaf, and he didn't want to spoil the conversation. And he pushed back his chair and wanted to see the students start to engage each other and to see how they interconnected. And the daughter, Martha Randolph Jefferson, teased him during the dinner party, which I find very amusing and opens up a whole other element of family life. And she first began by describing how Jefferson hated novels and reading novels, and how they tried to get him interested in the Scottish writer Sir Walter Scott, and he loathed them. But not willing to just leave it there, she then gently mocked his views that William Blackstone, the great English jurist, should not be taught in a law school in America because he would turn young Americans into British Tories and monarchists. And she said, my favorite author, though, is William Blackstone. Well, I don't think anyone reads law for a hobby or just fun. I mean, she was teasing him.
Well, that's extraordinary, Andrew. Our time is not our own. We are the amuse-bouche of this incredible meal. But I encourage you all to get this extraordinary book. It's filled with incredible things, and you'll learn a lot about the founding era. As we close, what is the thing you want people to take away from the study? Why did you write it? What is it you hope they take away from it?
And I think one should always see that institutions like this do reflect the weaknesses of their time. But I think he recognized one thing very important, that education, universities can lead to progress and improvement. And he had at least the humility to recognize, he said, people will one day look at me in the same way as I look back at my witch-burning ancestors. In other words, he recognized they would be seen as limited, and he insisted that the dead hand of the past should not guide the future. And it's fascinating when he talks about the Constitution and said, you know, there's a danger that there'll be a time when people see these things as sacred, and we were just mortals, and they need to realize that, and need to be willing to make the changes to improve society.
One of my favorite quotes to step on you, Andrew, is that you wouldn't expect a coat made for a young man to fit in an older person. Right?
That's right. A boy can't wear the same jacket for the rest of his life. I do salute our teachers here. The old head of Monticello used to say that school teachers are the most important people in America. I have to say, uh, although Jefferson's been criticized for letting public schools go in his plan, he always insisted, and he put forward 4 bills, that this was the most important thing. The problem is his bills were never going to be acceptable and his ideas acceptable because he wanted to exclude religion. And Virginia was really beginning to change. I don't think he could have passed. He didn't even want clergy teaching in the schools. I don't think he could have passed the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom 40 years later. And the one proposal put for a public school against him was put up by a Federalist and who's someone who's Federalist and Presbyterian, who actually had a complete disdain for working class whites and largely wanted to educate them because he was fearful of industrial action like in Britain and thought that this might keep them within the system.
Well, with that note, with the end, I want everybody to thank Andrew Shaughnessy. I want you to buy his book. And then welcome Kevin Butterfield.
Right.
Thank you. We have another section tonight where we're actually going to take it into the present and look to the future. And we're going to look at civic education in America today.
But before we do that, I want everybody to know it's Kevin Butterfield's birthday today. So
That it is. Thank you. So my name is Kevin Butterfield. It's my birthday, and thank you for being here on my birthday. I want to thank the Ammerman Family Foundation, as Doug did. Dennis and Joy and their family have been great supporters of Mount Vernon. We want to explore how Americans have approached civic education in the past, how we plan to approach it in the future, and what we know about effective civic education in the 21st century. Very briefly, because I just want to get to it, have a great conversation, and then go out and have a reception and continue that conversation. I want to introduce my 3 guests for this conversation. David Campbell, Packy J.D., Professor of American Democracy at the University of Notre Dame, chairs the Political Science Department, author of a number of books, including one called Why We Vote, How Schools and Communities Shape Our Civic Life. Christina Lash, Assistant Professor of K-12 Educational Leadership at the University of Nevada, Reno. Been awarded prestigious fellowships, authors publications, including ones like with titles like Making Americans, Schooling, Diversity, and Assimilation in the 21st Century. And Johan Neem is a professor of history at Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington. He's the co-editor of a great new volume on Jeffersonians and Power, also the author of a remarkable book on public education called Democracy's Schools, The Rise of Public Education in America. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage, and we'll have a brief conversation and then a reception. So thank you so much for being here tonight. We've had a great introduction to the founding era, looking at some of the conversations about what education was, the kinds of priorities that men like Washington and Jefferson had. And now we are in the 21st century, and we're thinking deeply, the nation is, about the nature of educating young people for citizenship, right? This is something I think that everyone on this panel and everyone in this room has thought about at great length. Can I ask you what sounds familiar in the kinds of things you were hearing about Washington's and Jefferson's priorities for education? What sounds familiar from that time to today? Johan, maybe I'll turn to you first. You've written at length about the transition from the 18th into the 19th and into the 20th centuries. How has the ideas about educating for citizenship changed over that amount of time?
Yeah, thank you. And it's nice to be here. I mean, one of the things that we have to remember about the way we talk about education is it's somewhat responsive. As Andrew showed of our founding fathers after the Revolution, they were responding to their most immediate concerns, which was that republics are fragile and unlikely to succeed and quite likely to fail. And a lot depends on the quality of the citizens, their intellectual capacities and their moral commitments, their commitment to the public good, most of all. Over time, that didn't go away, but it started to get displaced. And in the progressive era, for example, questions of assimilation, questions of adapting to an industrial society took the fore. Much of the language kind of returned during the Cold War, but one of the things I think that happened is that at the end of the Cold War, that language kind of stopped being the prominent language of our public leaders. And we were concerned about economic globalization. We were concerned about the rise of China and could we compete? And we also had a certain kind of self-confidence in ourselves that the founders never had in themselves. And I think what happened is we privatized the language. You know, Obama says at one point about higher education, so different than Jefferson is. We all know education is for jobs. And while education is for jobs, it's not just for jobs. And we lost sight of how fragile our republic is. And we didn't have leaders kind of explaining to us that we need to educate for citizenship, that has to be a primary purpose of K-12 and higher education. And I think that might be turning. I think there's a lot of thoughts going on. We've had a lot of experiences of the last few years that suggest to us we need to think about our civic life and the health of our citizenry and the health of our republic. So I think people are starting to think about those questions again. It's a good moment. But I do think we lost sight of how fragile this experiment is and how essential education is to meeting that challenge.
Christina, you're someone who looks closely at what's going on in classrooms, the kinds of ways we're preparing teachers to go into the classroom and perhaps be better educators for civic education for broader purposes. What do you see in language today in the 21st century about how teachers and the people teaching teachers are talking about civic education?
Well, I think we see that in so much of the education policy language that this focus of education has been shifting more towards education as a private good rather than as a public good. And I think, building what Johan was saying, I think that the more democratic purposes of education have been kind of pushed aside. And so one thing that we're trying to see in the way that we train future leaders is how do we get them to think about the multiple purposes of education. And we want to focus on individual child development, for example, and nurturing that among our students. But we also want our students to think critically about their role within a collective, within a broader democracy that is becoming more increasingly diverse. And so this is something that's now becoming crucial for us in our training of future school leaders and teachers is how do we make sure that those conversations are getting back into the classroom with our students so that both educators understand that in more complex ways, but that students can think about their own education in more complex ways too.
Can I follow up just briefly with you? What has been an approach to educating a diverse classroom that might have students from a few different countries, a few different languages spoken at home? Are there any insights into what we're learning in recent years as to the best ways to teach civics in particular to those kinds of diverse classrooms?
I can't speak to the civics classroom uniquely. My research looks at how schools more broadly teach what it means to be American. And so part of that is in the curriculum. So we think about where it comes out explicitly in the history curriculum or social studies or English curriculum. But we also know that schools teach what it means to be American in the everyday practices of schooling and the extracurriculars that are being offered and what's on the walls and who's being represented in the language policies of the schools. So I think we're seeing some ways in which educators are really trying to broaden the way that what it means to be American, who we are as a nation and who can join us is being expanded so that it's challenging a pretty narrow narrative that had been historically within the curriculum, of that who this nation belongs to. And so we're seeing amazing things in classrooms about that are bringing the voices of African Americans, Latinx individuals, Asian and Pacific Islanders, and are including that as part of the American story. But we know that we're not doing enough on that, that there isn't enough representation of those diverse communities making it into the curriculum and into this broader representation within schools. And that's hurting the way that a lot of students are able to identify as American when they're not able to recognize themselves as part of the citizenry. This makes it challenging for so many students to identify with that very idea of being American, even if they were born here. So that's something that we're seeing is changing in some classrooms, but needs to be done more.
I want to bring David into the conversation because one of the things that David Campbell, who said I could call him Dave, has brought into this conversation, and the thing that allowed me to start to wrap my head around the depth of this literature and the study of what works in classrooms for teaching civic education, for making more effective citizens in the classroom, is you've gone deep into the study, not just your own studies, but looking at all the various studies that are out there and what people have begun to learn, Dave. And when you study civic education, first of all, I wonder if you could help us, because I think a lot of people in the room maybe lack a 30,000-foot view of it. What are there national standards? Are there national expectations? Are there huge regional variations? How do you define civic education as you start to dive into it and try to wrap your head around where it stands now? Can you give us a big picture?
Sure. One of the great challenges of studying civic education is that the term civics as a course is actually fairly rare. You will find it in some places, in some districts, in some states, but for the most part, what we generically call civic education is actually taught in courses with names like government, whether it be at the AP level or in other versions, or social studies, or a variety of other terms. But broadly speaking, when we collectively refer to civic education, it's education about American government, governments of other nations as well. Often there's a little history, a little economics thrown in there. The idea being that this is a subject matter that is specifically designed to equip young people to be educated members of a democratic society, as was referenced in the earlier conversation. In terms of what we find nationally, there are no national standards when it comes to civics, because we actually don't have national standards really in any subject. But to the extent that we do pay attention to civics, it's through something that you may have heard of, known loosely or colloquially as the Nation's Report Card, more officially known as the NAEP exams, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. This is a set of exams that are given to students at different age levels around the country in different subject matters. Whenever you read a news story about how young people are doing in reading and math, it usually comes from NAEP, the Nation's Report Card. It comes as a surprise to many people to learn that the NAEP exams do include civics as a subject, just not very often, and not done at the same level or to the same extent that we find for other subject matter. And that is telling. It reflects the fact that we care enough to test on it, but we don't care enough to test as much on this subject as we do on reading and math, and in some states in science. And so I think it's sort of a glass half full, glass half empty situation when it comes to civic education. So it's not the case that civics is ignored. Sometimes you'll hear that. That's not true. In fact, the fact that we were able to celebrate two teachers today just reflects the fact that there's a lot of great work being done in the area of civic education. It's being done all over the country. But on the other hand, it doesn't get the same level of attention as other subject matters do. And I would say that that is a great tragedy. And unfortunately, we've seen the subject of civics, riven by the same polarization that we see in so much of American society, when I would go so far as to say there's no need for that, because I speak about civic education all the time, and I can assure you it is one of the rare things, and this is going to shock you, that conservatives and liberals and Republicans and Democrats can actually agree on. They actually agree that civic education is important. Now, they don't always agree on what exactly it means and what exactly should be done, but the very fact that they agree on the importance of it, I think, is itself a significant statement on where we're headed, or where we could be headed.
Johan, one of the things that comes to mind as I listen to both the first conversation and then this one is this idea of, and Christina touched on this at length, inclusiveness. Who's incorporated into the story? How do we better sort of, how do we think about that from an educator standpoint in order to find ways to facilitate that. What's your sense of this historically? Are there insights that you came to as you studied the history of education in terms of inclusiveness, the definition of who is an American that Christina was talking to us about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to build on Christina's point, the challenge we're facing right now is that a democracy can't work if the people don't see each other as fellow citizens. And so, in a sense, we need people to feel themselves as part of the nation. And the challenge we have is how do we then ensure that people do feel part of the nation? And one of the things that's true of the history of public education is we'll never get it right. Because one of the primary purposes of public schooling is to socialize young people into that nation. It's always the previous generation trying to socialize the next generation. And nobody will always fit the mold. And the challenge we have is that it's a problem without a solution. So we're not going to go back to the 1840s and say that, Catholics don't fit into the nation, and this is a Protestant nation. We're not going to go back. But the problems that those Protestants and Catholics were struggling with, we're still struggling with, which is how do we create a common vision that we can all see ourselves in so that when I look at you and you look at me, we see each other as fellow Americans worth caring about. And how do we do that in ways that will accommodate and recognize the diverse experiences of Americans today, but also will enable all Americans, I'm an immigrant, to see themselves in people like George Washington. Like, it has to be both ways. And we struggle. That's a hard thing, and we just have to keep at it, because if we don't see each other as a people, I think that's when we start to see the kind of challenges we're really facing today.
What you're describing, it sounds like exactly what you study in the classrooms, Christina. I asked Dave to take us to 30,000 feet. Can you bring us down into a room? Give us a sense of how this kind of work can be done to help build a more inclusive vision that allows students to see themselves in the nation?
So in one of the schools that I visited, we were seeing how teachers were trying to take a very different approach to civic education in response to political events, to big changes in policies, that these kinds of things served as catalysts for changes in civic education. And so this school had a predominantly Latinx population, predominantly second generation immigrant population, and not just Latinx. They had students coming from a variety of different regions of the world and countries, and spoke many different languages. But there was little attention to incorporating those groups within the kind of narrative of who we are as Americans prior to kind of these major catalyzing political events. So changes in immigration policy suddenly made the topic of immigration more salient. And so teachers then made a conscious effort to bring in more curriculum that represented the immigrant experience, specifically Mexican immigration. And so they brought in readings and new novels for students to be able to understand not only the story of migration, but to also connect that experience of immigration to who we are as a nation, to the experience of second and third generation Mexican Americans in the United States, so that students could not only see themselves in terms of their maybe identity of their parents or grandparents as immigrants, but have a connection too with the experience of their communities here as Americans, that they are part of the American story. Mm-hmm. And so that was something that made a difference to many students in being able to connect with American identity, that it wasn't conflicting with some of their other identities that they felt might have been excluded from that narrative.
Right. So Dave, you're about to get a handheld microphone because your microphone stopped working, and we're always ready with backups. And I think it should be working. And I want to go to you next too, because one of the things in talking with you a few weeks ago, I learned about was your study of communities and schools. So not just what's happening inside the school, but what's happening around the school. Could you help us to understand a little bit of your research and where your conclusions as to the communal influence on what's happening inside the classroom, and vice versa?
Sure. One way to think of a school is as a community. Now, that probably doesn't sound like a very revolutionary idea, but if you sort of take it to its logical end, there's actually a lot of potency there in thinking of, well, what is it that students are learning in school? And, Christina's given us a taste of the fact that the civics that students learn doesn't only happen in a class that we call civics or American government or social studies or any of the other terms that are used. Indeed, everything that goes on within a school is teaching students how to be a member of a community. And one of the things I have found in my work is that the communal aspect of a school, the ethos, to use a fancy $5 word, or the culture of a school, can actually stick with a young person as they age through the lifespan. In other words, you attend a high school where you learn to be a responsible member of that community so that you contribute to it, so that you're a part of it. You volunteer, you belong to clubs and associations, and you just simply care about it as a community. That actually leads you to be more likely to vote later in life and to be a volunteer in your community, two sort of quintessentially civic type activities. And those schools as communities that are reinforcing that idea that we should contribute to the common good are themselves embedded in larger communities, so towns and cities and counties and such, where those same norms are being reinforced. So it's not like the school is completely separate from, here's another fancy $5 word, the social capital that is being built within a community. That's the networks and associations that people make with one another that lead them to feel like they are part of a community. Schools are not divorced from that. They are part of it, and they are contributing to it. So it's a grand ecosystem where the schools are contributing to the communities outside of the schools, but then those communities are also feeding what goes on inside the school, which is why we need to care not only about what happens in the school, but what happens outside the walls of the school, because all of that contributes to the civic education of young people, but frankly, of all of us.
This is a really exciting conversation. One thing that I haven't been able to do in this conversation yet is to take us into higher education, as the first section of this night's event was focused on the rise of the University of Virginia. Johan, you've thought about this, and I wonder if you could briefly reflect on higher education and some of these civic goals. What's your read on the state of things now, some of the challenges that are faced in higher education today? Andrew and Doug have given us a little look at the 18th and 19th centuries. Where are we now?
Where are we now? I think where we are now, going back to what I said earlier about, quoting President Obama, is we really are interested in higher education for the workforce. And I don't want to pretend or deny, I'm a parent. I understand. I want my kids to do well. I don't want to deny that both a vibrant economy is a public good, and also we should care about providing social mobility and opportunities for children. But students come into my classroom having heard for much of their lives that getting an education is about getting ahead. And they're good people, and they're kind people. And I teach a course called College in America. And they haven't heard that part of the responsibility that they have is that they have a duty to the public good. That part of the reason we subsidize K-12 and higher education as taxpayers and citizens is because we are subsidizing an investment in them that will serve our society. They're not opposed to it. This is what's interesting to me, is that that's just not part of the rhetoric of higher education anymore. And they see a degree as a job, so they don't understand what the liberal arts are about. That most chemistry majors don't have to become chemists, and most history majors don't have to become historians, that these are about investments in capacities to think about the world. And so we've narrowed the scope quite dramatically of what we're asking of higher education. And our students aren't exposed in their earlier schooling or as much when they come to college that this is actually a public good that they're engaged in, and that there are some public responsibilities that come with their education. And so I think we've lost some of that rhetoric that Jefferson and Washington and others had about higher education and its purposes. And the hope is that we revive it. I don't think students oppose it. It's not part of their vocabulary when they enter. It's not what they've been told they're here for.
Christina, I asked Johan a tough question as sort of where are we now in higher education. I wonder if you could look ahead briefly. I don't know how far you want to look ahead, but do you feel like there are some trends, some patterns that you see in how we're approaching education today that you think are pointing us in a certain direction? What do you see just down the horizon?
I think there's a lot of optimism in terms of the way people are approaching civic education. We're seeing a lot of conversation around what should be included in the curriculum, and I think people are caring more about that question of how do we frame ourselves as a nation, right? What do we want reflected in not only the nation's past, but how do we help students think about relevant political issues that are happening in contemporary society? And so we see some exciting things happening where teachers are trying to engage students in seeing themselves as active citizens in a democracy that are capable of making change in their social political worlds. So we see strategies being used like youth participatory action research, where basically students are encouraged to develop projects in which they research an issue within their community that may be, something maybe like homelessness, for example, that they want to investigate. Students study this issue within their local community. They do research on the topic. They invite expert speakers to come talk to the class. But then the idea is that they're writing some kind of product to present to community members to address this issue. So it's helping students not only think critically about the issues themselves, but see themselves as playing a role in changing and bettering their society. And this is a huge part of what we want from civic education, is to engage students in that political process, to see themselves as part of shaping that democracy. So that's one strategy, I think, that is showing a lot of promise, a lot of potential in terms of re-engaging students in that process.
Great. David, same question. David Campbell, where do you see things heading in the near future, or in the medium term anyway, in terms of civic education? Any new trends, any new patterns, anything you'd like to point out?
Well, I actually would like to note that I fully agree that we've definitely gone down the path of thinking of education or framing education in terms of just workforce readiness. We use that term a lot, and that's unfortunate because, of course, a full education is so much more than that, including but not limited to civics. And yet, I still have hope, because when I interact with today's college students in particular, or it's been most of my time, I'm actually just struck by how much energy they have, how much hunger they have to make the world a better place. And I would go so far as to say the last 4 or 5 years that we've lived through in the United States, and perhaps in all liberal democracies, has really been our, if I can use an analogy, our Sputnik moment, in the same way that the launch of Sputnik by the Soviets spurred greater science education in the US. I would like to think that the challenges that we've seen liberal democracy face, both here in the United States and in other nations, has been a comparable moment for young people to recognize, I hope, the value of democracy. And can I just tell a Virginia story that I think it's a combination Virginia Notre Dame story that is just an example of why I actually do have hope that somewhere along the line, young people really are learning what it means to be civically engaged, maybe not because of what we do or in spite of what we do. You'll all remember the name of Bob McDonnell, your governor, from a few years ago. You may or may not know that he is actually an alum of the University of Notre Dame. And before he had his fall from grace, he visited Notre Dame. He was actually there to dedicate a center. And as part of his day on campus, we had him meet with a number of Notre Dame students. And I will tell you, it was a fascinating exchange. These students absolutely grilled your governor in a way that I think he found a little surprising. And when I say grilled, I don't mean that they asked him unfair potshot questions. And actually, this is before any of his scandals came up. It was actually just on his policy issues. And I watched these students interact with him civilly, but nonetheless very knowledgeably, And I was very proud because, frankly, I hadn't seen that in other exchanges earlier in the day with faculty. I hadn't seen it actually in other meetings with other leaders when we put faculty with political folks, but I did see it with our students. And it was, and I don't mean to pick on any particular politician. My point of the story is that these young people took seriously this opportunity to engage with someone in public life in a way that frankly all of us should be willing to do, because they knew their stuff. And where did they learn to do that? Well, maybe they learned it in college, I don't know, but I actually suspect that where they really learned it was in the AP government classes that they took in high school, or the other, similar type courses, because they were prepared. And when I look at experiences like that, it sort of reminds me that for all of our worrying about the kids these days, that maybe the kids are all right, and we just need to channel their energy in the right direction.
That's great. There's a question coming in from the audience, actually, and I'll ask Christina maybe to touch base first. Asking really, because you mentioned this about talking about contemporary issues and debates in classrooms, and Scott Williams asked a question about how civic education can address these clear divides on really hot button issues in classes in our civic life today. What strategies are teachers able to use to talk about something that can divide even a room like this, but particularly a room full of young people? Are there particular strategies that work? Are there ways, actually maybe lessons that the broader American populace could learn from how things are approached in class?
Sure. I think this context of political polarization is so important to what the implications for civic education, right? Because I think it's having a chilling effect in some ways for the kinds of conversations teachers feel like they can have in classrooms, because there are issues that are so divisive. And at the same time, we know how important it is for students to be able to develop skills to be able to deliberate these issues, right? That if we're trying to help students develop as these citizens in a pluralist democracy in which there are differences of opinion, how important it is to be able to then help them get practice having these conversations about these issues in classrooms, and to learn how to respect diverse opinions, and engage in these conversations in meaningful ways, and also getting them to think about their role then in shaping the decisions that get made in our society in the future. So this, I think, in terms of strategies, this, I think, is where it comes back to how we train also our school leaders and teachers, and how we model these kinds of conversations for them, so that they can bring this back into the schoolhouse. Because I think if teachers don't feel like they have the skills to kind of navigate the messiness and of those types of conversations, then they're more inclined to just not talk about the issues. And we know that that's actually doing a disservice to our students as we're trying to prepare them to be citizens, that we want them to be engaging in these conversations. So we need to better prepare our teachers for how to actually do that better with their students. And partially it's practicing it in their own classrooms, right? In the higher education setting, is modeling how we have those kinds of conversations where we do have diverse opinions about these issues in that setting.
That's great. David?
I would just like to underscore what Christina has said. Unfortunately, we often, and I say we meaning parents, educators, just members of the community, we often have an aversion to politics ourselves. And I mean politics with a lowercase p, just the general discussion of political issues, right? Everyone's uncomfortable when politics comes up. We're told by our mothers, don't talk about politics, don't talk about religion. It just so happens I've made my career talking about religion and politics, but that's another matter. But you know what? Most people don't like to talk about trigonometry. And yet somehow, in high school classrooms, we talk a lot about trigonometry. Somehow we figured out how to do that, even though we might have an aversion naturally to do it. And I would say, by way of analogy, the same is true for politics. That the idea that we should somehow shy away from it is a mistake. And I fear is one of the issues we face in the country, that we don't know how to talk to one another about political issues. And so the sort of messiness that Christina's describing is exactly the sort of thing that should be discussed in classrooms. And empirical evidence shows that it's in the classrooms where students feel like they can talk about these issues, and where teachers create an open climate, that's the jargony term for this. That actually means they learn more. And the kids who are most likely to benefit from that are those who are not receiving a civic education in the home. So in that sense, the school can do something that they maybe are not receiving through other channels. So the solution, I would say, is not to do less politics, but to do more of it, but to do it in the classroom, and to allow educators to do their jobs, and frankly, for parents and administrators to give the teachers cover so that they can do this in the classroom.
I just saw both of our teachers nodding, by the way. So, Johan, I want to bring it to you, perhaps as a last question, but I think maybe a few of you could all comment. Where's history in all this? We're at Mount Vernon, and as we talk about civic education and we talk about inclusiveness and finding ways for Americans to be able to discuss politics, whether in the classroom or outside, where is the study of history? Where are historic sites? What do you think? What are the connections, and what are the ways in which history can be a key part of this endeavor?
Yeah, well, I think, like so much, we teach history at the K-12 level for two purposes, and they sometimes feel like they're in conflict. One is socialization, to provide a common narrative, and finding that narrative is very hard because all of us need to find our way into that narrative. And the other is as a tool for critical engagement and learning how and why the things that exist today, good or bad, positive or negative, have come to be. And in some ways, how they can be undone, right? Because history also teaches us about contingency. I think what we need to do is recognize that those two purposes are constantly at play in classrooms, in historic sites, and that they can reinforce each other, but they're also, we can live with that tension that they portray. What we shouldn't do, and what I fear we see happening most recently, is presume that there is a history and a narrative and a truth. And that tendency, both on the right and the left, is that there is only one way to understand George Washington. He's either the greatest American or he's a terrible slaveholder. But he can't, but none of, we can't reduce him to like the fact that we know. And the same is true of the story of America. That we can't reduce it to this presumption that it's just owned by one thing. And I think that's the way we can maintain both the socialization and the capacity of history to be a critical tool. And a tool that empowers people to engage as citizens in challenging some of the problems we have today and understanding them. And that's what I fear about what's happening today, is that we're both sides tend to presume that they have the answer, and history becomes not a set of questions, but a set of presumptions. And that's not the way we should be doing it.
Christina, your thoughts on history and historical awareness as a part of this endeavor that we're discussing tonight?
So one thing that I'm seeing in my research is that history plays such an important role in the way that students understand the values of the nation. That we are this nation that values equality and justice and freedoms, individual freedoms. And that, I study middle school students. And so in U.S. history curriculum at that time, there's also a big focus on the constitutional amendments, on the progress that we've made as a society towards equality through the passage of the constitutional amendments. But one thing that I think needs to be an extension of that work is helping students understand those national ideals and how far we've come, but to also to be able to connect it back to contemporary society and to think about, where has the nation slipped? Where have we stumbled in our own work towards equality? Mm-hmm. What do we still need to do to be able to ensure that the citizenry does have equality and that individuals do have that experience, both at the individual level, and in terms of their groups, the social groups that people identify with. And I think that's what I'm seeing, at least in my own research, is not happening as much. And so students aren't being able to understand where we still need to go as a nation to meet our national ideals. And then what happens is that students who may have experiences in which they have not felt like they're equal members of society, that they are feeling either excluded or discriminated against, or they've encountered some kind of injustice in their life, they're not able to make sense of the contradiction between the values that we hold as a nation and their current experiences. And so one thing that we want to see more in the classroom is helping students both see the amazing progress we've done as a nation towards working towards our ideals, and history is so important for teaching us that. But then seeing also, so where are we now? Have we made it? And if we haven't made it, where do we need to go? What do we need to do to ensure that all members of the country do have that equality? And that gets them then critically thinking about it, right? And about their own role in shaping that future of the nation.
David, last word on this point. I understand you toured Mount Vernon today. So think about history, historic sites, and the role of that kind of historical awareness in civic education.
Well, if I could, I'm going to tell another story, which has nothing to do with the governor of Virginia, but actually about my son, who is now in his 20s. But when he was just a little guy, we lived first in Boston and then in Princeton, New Jersey. And so we took him to Bunker Hill, and we went to Valley Forge, and we actually went to a reenactment of the crossing of the Delaware. And yes, we went to Mount Vernon. And then we moved to Indiana. And my little son, who was then and now pretty precocious, actually, he asked us, well, what did George Washington ever do in Indiana? Which sounds like I'm making that story up, but that's absolutely true. And of course, we had to break the news to him that, well, Washington never really made it to Indiana because there really wasn't an Indiana in his lifetime. I mention that because I'm a big believer in making history come alive to students. And I don't say that as a historian, so I'm not just shilling for my own discipline. I really do believe in history. And the reason is what we've heard here. When you introduce history, especially visits to historic sites that are interpreted in a fun and an exciting way, it teaches students that the challenges we face today are actually echoes of challenges we've faced in the past. And anything that we can do to just reinforce the idea that democracy is messy, and I love that phrase, anything we can do will help prepare young people to be active members of a democratic society, because that's what they have to get used to, that we all have to get used to, is disagreeing with one another and learning how to do that in a way that is constructive and not destructive. And I think learning about the challenges of the past is a really important part of doing that. And I applaud Mount Vernon as I went through the exhibits today. You know, it's not like they shied away from the fact that throughout his life, Washington faced challenges, and he was a politician. Let's acknowledge that. That meant he wasn't just a king on the hill. He actually had to get down and figure out how to get stuff done in a brand new system. But that's true for many of our great leaders. So I'll just close by noting in my course that I teach to introduce students to American politics, I very deliberately use Steven Spielberg's movie Lincoln. I have them watch Lincoln, and then I use clips of it all throughout the semester. And the reason I do that is many of the challenges that are highlighted in that movie, and therefore in Lincoln's life and his time as president, really do speak to issues that we have today. But by highlighting Lincoln in the past, my hope is I can avoid just getting caught up in an argument between Republicans and Democrats in the current period, but instead look at these same sort of questions through a historic lens, which I found generally works. You know, students are able to relate to it, and we can sort of put aside, what they've heard that day. I was going to say what they read in the newspaper, but no young person even knows what a newspaper is. What they saw on Twitter that morning, and instead we can get down to the real issues.
Well, thank you to all of you. Thank you to David Campbell, Christina Lash, Johan Neem. And now we get to celebrate the 8th anniversary of the library, as Doug mentioned. That is why we have this event in late September, is to celebrate the opening of the Washington Library here. So thank you. Thank you to Andrew. Thank you to Doug for the first half of the session. And thank you to all of you for being here tonight. Thank you to all you out there watching us virtually. And let's thank our guests one more time.